Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Jason Freeman. I work here in the Author Events office, and I'm very excited to be here tonight to introduce Joshua Ferris and Jim Shepard. The Seattle Times calls Joshua Ferris's Then We Came to the End a truly affecting novel about work, trust, love, and loneliness. It won the 2008 Hemingway Award for Best First Novel and was a finalist for the National Book Award. His other works include The Unnamed and To Rise Again at a Decent Hour, which was shortlisted for the 2014 Man Booker Prize. One of the New Yorker's 20 under 40 writers and a winner of the International Dylan Thomas Prize, Ferris has published fiction in Granta, Prairie Schooner, and Best American Voices, among many other places. His latest book is called The Dinner Party. His first story collection, it's rife with characters searching for grace in the aftermath of life's pitfalls, especially the title story. It's a scorcher. You got to read it. In the New York Times Book Review, Lauren Groff writes, quote, Joshua Ferris has proved his astonishing ability to spin gold from ordinary air. And tonight's other author, the New York Times, praises Jim Shepard for, quote, nailing entire worlds together with teeming, precise detail. He is the author of 7 novels, including The Book of Aron, Lights Out in the Reptile House, and Project X. A writer's writer, if there ever was one, he is perhaps even more celebrated for his short fiction, which has appeared in publications ranging from the Paris Review to Playboy. His story collections include Love and Hydrogen, You Think That's Bad, and one of my very favorite all-time books, Like You'd Understand Anyway. I don't know how you pronounce that title, but there's 10 different pronunciations I've toyed with. It was a finalist for the National Book Award and a winner of the Story Prize. His new collection is called The World to Come, exploring the emotional hazards of everyday life writ large on the canvases of historic tragedy and triumph. The Boston Globe says these stories add up to a peculiar yet arresting vision, as Shepard lets you see a startling variety of dangers and conundrums through the eyes of characters who, poignantly or even despairingly, can't quite summon the humanity that's hidden away in them. That's very much a review-sounding quote right there. Here to tell us more about his work first, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Joshua Ferris to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
It's always a pleasure to be on stage with, well, I guess we're not technically on stage together, but it's nice to be in view of Jim Shepard, that man of peculiar vision. I'm going to leave it up to you to tell me what I should read. I have 2 options for you, and if I could see a show of hands, I'll do a brief description of these 2 stories, and you can tell me what I should read. One is the title story from this collection called The Dinner Party. It's about a couple who are anticipating their friends showing up any moment as they prepare, or rather as the wife prepares the meal, and their friends throw them for a loop. And then the other story is called A Fair Price, and it's about 2 guys moving out of storage. So who's for the dinner party? Okay, that did it. It was really greeted with the same enthusiasm by my editor. Okay, so this is from The Dinner Party. And what I'm going to do essentially, I guess, is just read until I have no more time or I see some heads nodding off. I guess that would be 15 to 20 minutes, so that would put me in this. Okay. All right, I know where to stop. The Dinner Party. On occasion, the 2 women went to lunch, and she came home offended by some pettiness. And he would say, why do this to yourself? He wanted to shield her from being hurt. He also wanted his wife and her friend to drift apart so that he never had to sit through another dinner party with the friend and her husband. But after a few months, the rift would heal and the friendship returned to good standing. He couldn't blame her. They went back a long way, and you got only so many good friends. He leapt 4 hours ahead of the evening and saw, in future retrospect, that he could predict every gesture, every word. He walked back to the kitchen and stood with a new drink in front of the fridge out of her way. I can't do it, he said. Can't do what? The balls were up in the air, water coming to a boil on the stove, meat seasoned on the butcher block. She stood beside the sink, dicing an onion. Other vegetables, bright and doomed, waited their turn on the counter. She stopped cutting long enough to lift her arm to her eyes in a tragic pose. Then she resumed more tearfully. She wasn't drinking her wine. I can tell you everything that will happen from the moment they arrive to the little kiss on the cheek goodbye, and I just can't goddamn do it. You could stick your tongue down her throat instead of the kiss goodbye, she offered casually as she continued to dice. She was game, his wife. She spoke to him in bad taste freely, and he considered it one of her very best qualities. But then that would surprise her, I guess, not you, she said. Okay, they come in, he said. We take their coats. Everyone talks in a big hurry as if we didn't have 4 long hours ahead of us. We self-medicate with alcohol. A lot of things are discussed, different issues. Everyone laughs a lot. But later, no one can say what exactly was so witty. Compliments on the food, a couple of monologues. Then they start to yawn. We start to yawn. They say, we should think about leaving, huh? And we politely look away like they've just decided to take a crap on the dinner table. Everyone stands. One of us gets their coats, peppy goodbyes. We all say, what a lovely evening. Do it again soon, blah, blah, blah. And then they leave, and we talk about them, and they hit the streets and talk about us. What would make you happy? She asked. A blowjob. Let's wait until they get here for that, she said. She slid her finger along the blade to free the clinging onion. He handed her her glass. Drink your wine, he said. She took a sip. He left the kitchen. He sat on the sofa and resumed reading his magazine. Then he got up and returned to the kitchen and poured himself a new drink. That's another thing, he said. Their big surprise. Even their goddamn surprises are predictable. You need to act surprised for their sake, she said. Wait for a little opening, he said, a little silence, and then he'll be very coy. He'll say, why don't you tell them? And she'll say, no, you. And he'll say, no, you. And then she'll say, okay, I'll tell them. And we'll take in the news, like we're genuinely surprised, like, holy shit, can you believe she's knocked up? Someone run down for a lotto ticket. Someone tell Veuve Clicquot, that bastard will want to know. And that's just the worst, how predictable our response to their so-called news will be. Well, okay, she said, when that happens, why don't you suggest that they have an abortion? He chewed his ice and nodded. That would shake things up, wouldn't it? Tell them we can do it right here with a little Veuve Clicquot and one of the bedroom hangers. Delightful, he said. I'm in. The kitchen was small. He would have done better to remain in one of the other rooms, but he wanted to be with her. She was sautéing the garlic and the onion. He's okay, he said. They're both okay. I'm just being a dick. We do this, she said, what, at most, once or twice a year. I think you can handle it. And when they have the baby, oh, Christ, he said. When they have the baby, we'll see even less of them. Holiday cards, he said. Here's our little sunshine. See our little sunshine? Christ. You aren't the one who's going to have to go to the baby shower, she said. How much you want to bet they buy a stroller? A stroller? Yeah, a stroller, he said. He put cheese on a cracker. To cart the baby around in. I'm going to wager the odds of a stroller are high, she said. But if you had a baby, there'd be no stroller, am I right? Because it would be oh so predictable to have a stroller, wouldn't it? I was thinking we could duct tape the child, he said. It would be cheaper. Like a baby, Bjorn, she said, but duct tape. Exactly. And would the baby face in or out? If it was sleeping in, not sleeping, kind of kicking its feet, wanting to see the world, we'd duct tape it out so it has a view. Allowing the child to be curious, she said, feeding its desire to marvel at this new experience called life. Yeah, something like that. The child must be so relieved that I'm barren, she said. He left the kitchen. He stood in the living room with his drink, listening to the sounds of her cooking. Now, they should have invited Ben and Lauren like last time. Ben and Lauren were more his friends. With Ben and Lauren there, time didn't move as it did in funeral parlors and in the Midwestern churches of his youth. But she had wanted it just the 4 of them this time, probably so that they could more freely revel in their big news. And there was a limit to how many times he could say, unprompted, hey, should we invite Ben and Lauren? At least he was doing Ben and Lauren a favor. He returned to the kitchen. When they come in, he said, let's make them do a shot, both of them. A shot of tequila, yeah. Her too? Both of them. To sort of fortify the baby, she said. Yeah, we'll force them somehow. He said, well, I'll figure it out. Better hurry, she said. All this talk of folic acid and prenatal vitamins, give me a break. Do they think Attila the Hun got his daily dose of folic acid when he was in the womb? Napoleon? She was going back and forth across the kitchen while he kept his drink close. I could go on. George Washington, she said, a founding father. See, I could go on. Moses. I don't think she's going to be willing to do a shot, she said. We trick her somehow, tell her it's full of prenatal vitamins, and boom, she shoots it down. Because she just graduated from the 3rd grade, she said, and she's blind and retarded. I'll think of something, he said. He left the kitchen again. On his way back in, he said, okay, I've got it. But the kitchen was empty. Her wedding ring and the one with the diamond were on the counter, where she always put them before starting to cook. The sink had filled with dishes. On the stove, the big pot and the smaller one unfurled steam into the rattling vent. The door under the sink hung open. Amy? He said. No answer. Where was she? He turned and walked back the way he came, through the apartment, in the unlikely event that she had passed him by without noticing as he was lying on the sofa. Then he returned to the kitchen, to the animated appliances and stewing ingredients. She came in through the front door. Where'd you go? Took the garbage out, she said. I would have done that. But you didn't, she said. He had come into the kitchen with a whole new approach to the evening, but after she went missing, he was no longer in the mood to provoke her. Instead, he set his drink down and went up to her at the stove. He threaded his arms around her waist as she stirred one of the pots. Years earlier, they had a name for this hug. He couldn't remember what it was now. He kissed her neck, then the back of her hair. Her hair smelled of steam and shampoo and fake wildflowers. What can I do, he said. You can set the table, she said. He set the table. Then he stood with his back to the refrigerator with a new drink. So I figured it out, he resumed. They bring the bottle of wine, right? We thank them, but then we don't open it. We tuck it away in the kitchen. They never see it again. We start the evening. We don't ask them what they want to drink. It's just an oversight on our part. Because I know him, even if she's not drinking, because of the big news, he'll want to drink. I tell them that we've run out. I tell them we'll open their wine at dinner, but then we don't. We just have water for the table. Then, in the middle of the meal, no alcohol, she said. You should work for Al-Qaeda. In the middle of the meal, I get up and go to the kitchen and I bring back a beer for myself. I open it at the table and take a long drink. What do you think? Sounds promising, she said. He says, hey, got another one of those? And I'm like, oh, actually, this is my last one. And then I kill it. Do you think they would leave? Leave? No. Really? They wouldn't leave after that? Where the hell are they anyway? They might never come back, but no, they would not leave. You know, they're good people, he said, ultimately. She's my oldest friend, she said, and he can be very funny. You're right, he can be funny. Later, he came out of the bathroom, just as the toilet was completing its roar. She was no longer in the kitchen. He took another cheese and cracker. He walked past the dressed table to the living room. She sat on the sofa reading the same magazine he had been reading. He stood in the middle of the room and held out his hands. Where are they? For one thing, that's predictable, she said. It's her running late. Sure, but it's going on 45 minutes. They'll be eating some very cold appetizers. Have you cooked the meat? Everything but. She casually flipped through the magazine. There was no outrage or impatience. She seemed resigned to waiting as long as it took. You should maybe call her, he said. Isn't this what you wanted, she asked. Something unpredictable? She was on the phone calling around. It was 9 o'clock and then it was 10, going on 10:30. She tried to reach them a dozen times in a dozen different ways. She sent texts and emails. They didn't pick up and they didn't reply. Not when it interferes with dinner, he said. Nice, she said. Magnanimous and humane. Listen, don't worry about those fucking drips, he said. They have fallen asleep watching Friends on DVD, for which they have locked their doors and silenced their phones. Yes, she said. She was speaking into the phone now. Okay, thank you. Can you take my number just in case one of them comes in? Thank you. She left her name and number and hung up. Is it really possible, she said. She was dialing the next number. Is it really possible that you care about no one but yourself? I'm trying to be helpful. Your help isn't worth a good goddamn anymore, she said. He didn't like to be reminded. He left the room. Sure, she said to the phone. I love to hold. Is this meat going bad? He called out. He was in the kitchen. He had finished the cheese and crackers, the mini caprese salad she'd made with grape tomatoes, and the figs wrapped in bacon, caramelized with a homemade glaze. Now he was sitting on a bar stool, eating a saucer of the mushroom risotto that was meant to go with the lamb, while staring at the meat on the butcher block. He had opened another bottle of wine. Hey, babe, this meat? Should we do something with this meat? Stick it up your ass, she said. He stopped chewing. He looked with raised eyebrows at the 2 mustard-seasoned racks of lamb and thought how unpleasant it would be to insert one of their bony ribs into his butthole, but how much fun to walk out into the next room and moon her with a rack of lamb between his cheeks. Stick it up my ass, huh? He said. You know who should stick it up whose asses it should be stuck up is, or your 2 friends of yours, their asses. They should stick it up their asses, he said. Another hospital had no record either, and again she left her name and number. She walked into the kitchen. What are you muttering? There are 2 racks there, 1 for each of their asses. She put her fingertip on his forehead. This isn't like them, she said, pushing his head back. And you know it's not like them, and you're not being helpful. She released him, and he sprang back on the stool to an upright position. I'm sorry, am I supposed to be helpful? He said, because I thought my help was no longer worth a goddamn. She left the room. Wait, he said. He dropped the risotto to the counter and got off the stool. Hold on. He followed her through the dining room. Obviously, I'm not saying, will you stop? Will you listen to me, please? That I don't want to be helpful. Will you please turn around and listen? She stopped and turned. They just got their dates wrong is all, he said. And tomorrow when they call, they'll tell you how sorry they were. They had to turn their phones off during the late showing of Kung Fu Panda or something. So they went to see Kung Fu Panda tonight, she said. Something like that. My adult friends went to see Kung Fu Panda tonight, and they turned their phones off so they wouldn't ring during Kung Fu Panda. Or, he said, or, he put up a finger. They were standing near the bathroom doorway. There was a dim light coming from the dark room, and he was suddenly irrationally afraid, as he had been as a child, that if anyone stepped inside, if she stepped inside, she would plummet to the center of the earth. He lowered his finger. I'm sorry, he said. I don't think they went to see Kung Fu Panda. You do not think, period, she said. She stepped inside the bedroom. She did not plummet down, but floated across the murk into the bathroom. She waited until the door was shut before switching on the light. He sat on the kitchen floor for 30 minutes. Then he said, hey! He got no response. He stood and went into the bedroom. He found her in bed. She was in her pajamas. She was propped up against the headboard, reading a book in the lamplight. What are you doing? Going to bed. The meat is still on the counter. He said, there's food everywhere. Are we just going to let it go to waste? And aren't you worried about your friends? I'm not hungry, she said. Should you really be reading a book right now? What else would you suggest I do? I don't know. Go over to their apartment, see if they're there. I need to wait here in case I get a call from a hospital or in case they show up. He sat down on the bed. He put his head in his hands. He heard the slow turn of one page after another, and then deeper in the ears, the squishy beat of his sobering heart. Well, he said, looking up, would you like me to go over there? What are you going to do about it, big man? Man of steel? Going to get inside the Absolute Mobile and go find the big danger? He stared at her. It's too bad we can't have children, she said. If she was ever abducted, what better daddy to go and save her? Her? Is that right? Is it a her? He said. I guess it would be important for you to have a boy, wouldn't it? So you could pass along all those masculine skills of yours, all your big man powers. He stood up from the bed. Do you want me to go over there or not? Thank you.
That's not the end of that story. It gets better after that. Wouldn't you say, Josh? The whole book just gets better. It just ramps up from there. Given how much you enjoyed hearing Josh read, I figured I'd do something else entirely. So I'm going to talk more than read. I'm going to talk about that peculiarity that I keep being accused of. And then I'll go on for about 15 minutes and we'll stop and we'll start interacting with each other and with you guys, and then we'll get you out of here and we can all get shit-faced. I once gave a reading at Notre Dame in a gigantic hall for about 15 undergraduates who seemed to have been chosen nearly completely for their unresponsive faces. And when it came time for the Q&A, there was this one small woman in the front row who raised her hand and said, "Yeah, I have a question. Where do you get your ideas?" And she said it exactly the way your mom would say it if you brought in like a beaver pelt that had been on the road for 8 hours or something like that. As you heard from my introduction, I've been continually interested in what one other reviewer delicately called persistently unusual subjects. And over the years, it's gotten worse. In recent years, I've written about the executioner in charge of the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. I've written about Nazi explorers on the hunt for the Yeti, high school football players in Texas, an autodidact who became the first Western woman to explore the Arabian deserts alone, the first female cosmonaut in space, a servant of the murderous Jules de Rais, Japanese special effects wizards, Polish winter mountaineers, and I've even had a story narrated by the creature from the Black Lagoon. I seem, in other words, to have the inner life of a 10-year-old. And a number of these stories have actually featured real people, as that list would suggest, as their narrator protagonists. People like Attorney General John Ashcroft, or former Attorney General John Ashcroft, or the bass player John Entwistle of The Who, what my agent calls the libel cycle. And my dad, who used to always be on the lookout for litigation, would always say when he heard about these stories, why are you doing that? You know, what little money you have, they're just going to take from you. So I thought I would try to answer that question, which is how I came up with this little talk. Fiction like that, which is certainly not history and is not nonfiction, is intended, I think, to deliver many of the pleasures of both. I've always been struck my entire reading life by how much non-fictional pleasure many fictions actually deliver, how much non-fictional pleasure we ask of fiction. If we read Big Two-Hearted River, we feel like we're not only learning about the human heart, we're also learning a little bit about trout fishing. And if we read War and Peace, we're not only learning about emotional intricacy, but also about Napoleonic warfare. And in fact, I think we'd be a little depressed or dismayed to discover, if a historian said, Tolstoy knew nothing about Napoleonic. And we'd be like, really? Oh, shit, that kind of thing. Hemingway never went trout fishing. Really? History, fiction, the kind of fiction I write is not history and it's not science and it's not nonfiction, but it has its uses, I think, when it comes to enhancing the sort of insights that those other disciplines can enable. A few years ago, I read at Brown University, and in the audience there was a historian named James Campbell who had just come out with a book on the slave trade called Middle Passage, and he was just beside himself with what he thought I was doing. He was like, "This is so great." He goes, "You just speculate." And I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "But what I like about it is you speculate responsibly." And I was like, wow, talk about a blurb that won't sell a book. All historians he understood relied on their informed imaginations. But they were also required to shackle those imaginations much more than they would have liked to, right? There's always that moment in the history, those of you who've read histories, where they go, of course, we can't know for sure, and there's really no way of knowing. And all of those buzzkill moments that fiction writers don't have to worry about, because we do know for sure. We can know for sure. We just decide that, right? The fiction writer not only has more license, that seems like an obvious fact, but more license, I think, to try to create in the service of the facts on which we all mostly agree. which means that when you combine the meticulous research and the intensely empathetic imagination on display in a novel like Michael Shara's The Killer Angels or Jim Crace's Quarantine, you're very possibly provided with a more visceral understanding of what it may have been like at the Battle of Gettysburg, or what it may have been like to be a confused but passionate 18-year-old who's decided he's a first-century prophet, than can be generated by any of the more traditional histories, with their, again, obligatory and continual nods towards the limitation of what we can know. Now, given what I do, I'm excited by this kind of writing because of the way it enhances a fiction writer's possibilities. I tell my students one reason we're attracted to this kind of material is because it's a way of enlarging our contact with the world. There's so much to learn, even if you're not a nerd. And people who write and probably read the kind of fiction I'm talking about are the kind of hopeless nerds whose hearts lift in anticipation when they hear there's yet another 300-page volume on the eruption of Krakatoa about to come out. So part of my attraction to that kind of material is as simple as just doing everything I can when I'm writing to stay in touch with play, with the passionate engagement that we all manage as children. And that seems to me, by the way, Jim said in a digression, also one of the best methods of addressing the issue of writer's block. All of us who've tried to do something creative have had to face the issue of what to do when the analytic voice on your shoulder starts intervening prematurely and killing everything in its cradle by announcing it's not good enough or it's not original enough or whatever. And getting ourselves back into that creative track is not just a matter of, as a famous writer once famously put it, lowering our standards, although that's part of it. It's also a matter of remembering that we need to reconnect with the notion of this sort of creation as play. And if we keep the notion of play in the formulation, we remind ourselves that we don't necessarily know what we're doing at first, and that that's okay. For a little while, we get to cut ourselves some slack. Imagine you come across a little girl in the sandbox. You ask her what she's building. If she says to you, I don't know, you don't say, well, then get out of the sandbox. If you don't know what you're doing, get out. And if she says to you, I think I'm building a castle, you don't go, oh, castle, that's original. Yeah, nobody's ever built a castle before. Think you're going to build a castle nobody's ever built? The kid's like, relax. I'm here, I'm doing it, and when I'm finished, you tell me whether you like it or not as a castle, okay? Those inner children who just want to be left alone to play, ask yourself where any of the artists you most admire would be without them. Walter Murch, the great film editor responsible for Apocalypse Now and The Conversation, once pointed out, as I've gone through life, I found your chances for happiness are increased if you wind up doing something that's a reflection of what you loved most when you were 10 years old. I want to enlarge my contact with the world because the world is such a staggering and uncanny and heartbreaking place. And as a writer, I also want to do so because it's a way of enlarging the arena of my autobiographical obsessions. It's a way of expanding those elements in my background that are working to proscribe all of my choices. I come from an Italian family in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I have written more than once about Italian families in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I don't only want to write about Italian families in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm looking, in other words, for ways of making myself into a more interesting human being. I'm looking for ways to complicate my experience, to further interrogate and exploit that relationship between my imagination and my experience. I tell my students, do you feel like complaining when starting to write that nothing ever happens to you? Then think back. And if you still feel like complaining, then go engage the world because something is always happening to it. Another way of putting that might be to say that I have finally started to fully understand the importance of letting the world teach me. Émile Zola, the 19th century French novelist, when he was wanting to fathom the lives of coal miners for his novel Germinal, decided he would go down into the mines of Enzan. He went down into the mines and he encountered a percheron, a giant draft horse, pulling a sled through a tunnel, and the tunnel was about 6 inches bigger than the percheron. And Zola said to the miners, "Oh my God, how do you get that percheron out of here every night?" And they all started laughing. And he said, "What's so funny?" And they said, "Mr. Zola, that foal comes down here once when he's a baby. And he grows up down here. And he goes blind down here hauling coal. And when he dies, we bury him down here." And Zola said, "Thank you." Because he had just been given an epiphanic understanding of the lives of miners that he only got because he encountered the world in that way. And right now you're sitting there saying, "Sure, Jim, that's easy for Zola. What about me?" And in fact, the first worry that writers have when they consider working with such things like real events or historical events has to do with the issue of authority. As in, where do I get off writing about that? And here's what I tell my students. Here's the good and the bad news. Where do you get off writing about anything? Where do you get off writing about your mother? Where do you get off writing about another gender? Where do you get off writing about yourself from 20 years ago? Writers shouldn't lose sight of the essential chutzpah involved in trying to imagine any other kind of sensibility, and we should take heart from that chutzpah as well. The whole project of literature, the entire project of the arts, is about the exercise of the empathetic imagination. Why were we given something as amazing as imagination if we refuse to use it? If the axiom, "write what you know," is understood to mean write what you have experienced in terms of the events of your life, then that axiom seems to offer a vision of literature that does no justice to the empathetic imagination. It is not as if other writers we admire haven't shown us the way. Why do we routinely assume that we can imagine ourselves into Emma Bovary's head as readers, and then doubt so fiercely that we can do so as writers? We need to bear in mind, as we've been told many times, that we're working from, but not necessarily about, our lives. Poet Seamus Heaney had a nice way of putting it. He said, "I don't suggest the self is not the proper arena for poetry, but I do believe the greatest work occurs when a certain self-forgetfulness is attained." I also find that it's getting increasingly hard to take one's eyes off the world. Some of you might have noticed, for example, that we have, what shall we call it, a shitstorm of a government right now. As my loved ones will instantly and wearily tell you, I've been preoccupied with catastrophe my entire life. And the good news for me, as we head into America in 2017, is it's taken me from being a faintly worrisome fringe figure to someone who seems like I'm just reading the papers. So what happens when you attempt to write serious literary fiction about historical or current events or real people? Well, the good news is, as you might expect, you're already provided with characters and a situation. And the bad news is, as you might expect, you're already provided with characters and a situation. If you decide to write about the maiden voyage of the Titanic, it would appear as though a large amount of your plot were already in place. But the crucial verb there is appear. I give my students, in fact, sometimes an exercise involving the Titanic that goes like this. I write on the board 2 sentences. A man and a woman, book passage on the Titanic. That's the first sentence. The second sentence is the woman knows what's about to happen. The man doesn't. That's paradigmatic, by the way. Then I tell them to pick up the story and continue writing from there. They all think it's an exercise in plotting. But they quickly come to understand that, in fact, it's an exercise in characterization, since before they can move forward with the plot, they have to decide who these people are and how they're related. Which is another way of saying that the plot of the Battle of Gettysburg may seem to you set, but is in fact a heck of a lot different if your protagonist is some poor schmo in the middle of Pickett's charge than it is if your protagonist is Robert E. Lee. And I think fictions that make the most exhilarating use of history or science, whether they're novels like Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian, and if you haven't heard of that, your whole evening was worth it just for that, or Marta Morazzoni's The Invention of Truth, or short stories like Nathan Englander's The Tumblers or Ken Kalfus's PU 239, they understand this duality, I think. A, fictions about real events do in some ways need to respect the facts. And B, as our politicians have taught us, facts are malleable things. The trick, it seems, is to do everything possible to honor A, as you understand it, while taking full advantage of B to shape your material into something aesthetically appealing. A long time ago, I read an interview with Alan Gurganis in which he said, or he remarked, that it was the writer's job to take the world personally. I think that's true. When I read about the WHO or John Ashcroft or the disaster at Chernobyl, I'm reading about it because I'm interested in the subject, but if I continue to read about it, that's because my emotions have been engaged in some ways. And at that moment, when I'm reading, I'm beginning to read receptively. That is, I'm beginning to pay attention to how what I'm reading is affecting me and why. You might say that if I'm, for example, reading about the catastrophe at Chernobyl, I'm simultaneously storing away facts about the disaster and keeping an eye on the spectacle of my own ongoing affective reaction to what I'm reading. And if I don't find some sort of plangent emotional resonances with what I discover about these situations or these figures, then I won't write fiction about them. Think about it this way. Drama is everywhere. Suffering is everywhere. Why do some things affect us so much and others don't? People come up to you in lunch and go, oh, my God, did you hear about that thing in Kenya? You're like, I know, it's terrible. Are we going out later? Because if we're going to do... Or you find you can't get it out of your head. And those ones you can't get out of your head, you can't get out of your head because in some ways something's been triggered. In some ways, some emotional resonance has been found. What that is something we try to pay attention to. When I'm engaged that way, I find myself starting to construct a combination of what I know about such subjects, what I intuit about such subjects, and what I project upon such subjects. The arithmetic might look something like this: raw information plus insight plus passion equals your version. Or maybe the situation might best be rendered by a Venn diagram. Let's say in this case, we imagine one large sphere. That's the experience of having been a gay, silent filmmaker in Weimar, Germany. In other words, of having lived the life of F.W. Murnau, the director of Nosferatu and Sunrise and The Last Laugh, about whom I once wrote a novel. And let's imagine the other sphere is the sphere of the writers. So you have one sphere is Jim, one sphere is Murnau. It's that little sliver of overlap, mostly of crucial emotional agendas and conflicts, and not so much of life experiences, that creates the connection that allows everything else to be accessed, at least in imagination. And when the process succeeds, and it by no means succeeds with every figure that initially attracts my interest, those real world people with whom I'm working turn into personae, figures who both are and are not those actual public figures. And I think what happens in cases like this is that I stumble upon a shared emotional genealogy that the research helped me uncover. Which makes sense, given that, as others have pointed out, when we read literature, we send ourselves as far into another sensibility as we can, and then we return to ourselves with a perception that both is and is not our own now, a much more complicated perception. And here's the happy paradox. Such distancing, I think, seems to enable a new and unexpected outbreak of emotional honesty and intimacy within our work, both of which are crucial to producing original and important work. Oscar Wilde had a great insight about that. He said, "Man is least himself when he talks in his own persona." Give him a mask and he'll tell you the truth. Oscar Wilde. Now there's a weird poster boy for emotional honesty. With work like that, I think we're engaging what feels like objective reality and an intensely subjective inner experience. And because of the way objective reality is being viewed as so idiosyncratic, the potential's there for the work to seem both authoritative and surprisingly personal. We're reminded that we might fathom ourselves more fully if we direct a more perfect attention to what's around us. I'm going to say that again as though it were important. We're reminded we might fathom ourselves more fully if we direct a more perfect attention to what's around us. Ernest Hemingway's way of articulating that was a hard light thrown on objects softly illuminates the beholder, which is not, by the way, a bad summary of Ernest Hemingway's entire aesthetic. That way of operating also reminds us how much the giving of oneself is involved in perceiving. As the philosopher Simone Weil put it, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. So I guess what I'm asserting is this song of everyone else that I seem to be composing when I write about other people is turning, not so surprisingly, into a song of myself. And people who are suspicious of such methods, and they're out there, people who only allow themselves to be really moved by stories that they suspect to be directly autobiographical in their events. You know, I heard this really happen to her. As if all literature aspired to the condition of memoir. Mistakenly equate, I think, what seems to be that unmediated and autobiographical set of events with sincerity or honesty. Which is a little like saying vanilla ice cream is more sincere than Rocky Road. The favor of imagining other people's lives might be the best we can do for each other. And the arts educate us in that ability. And to quote Alan Gurganis again, we have to give ourselves over to other people, no matter how inconvenient or intimidating or boring that process might seem to be, because that's the only way we're going to continue to renew ourselves. I try to think of it as the most useful sort of human exchange. In turning over, or trying to turn over, my imagination to distant and initially alien sensibilities, I'm continually giving myself away in both senses of the phrase. And I'm continually trying to gather others into me in a way that Walt Whitman wrote about much more eloquently, but in a way I hope he would recognize. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
I think there's the tendency to do this when you have two authors in an evening, and to, at least for me, to try and think about what those authors' works have in common. And I was thinking about the first story, the title story for both of you, and, you know, one is out on an ocean Air Force radar platform, and one is in an apartment before a dinner party. But something to me seemed, for both of those stories, that they were lurching towards the inexorable, towards the inevitable, that there's this heavy, pervading sense of doom lying over both of them. But it comes in still an unexpected way. I was wondering if both of you could talk about the pleasures, the difficulties of writing in that way, and towards this something that you know will happen, but is kind of tough anyway.
I bet we could.
Okay, go for it.
One of the things I really love about Josh's work, and I try to aspire to in my own, is that sense of, that dread of being called to account. And you could really hear it in the dinner party. It's a gorgeous story. And the humor, you know, all of the performativity of the narrator sort of going, you know, I don't give a shit about anything. And the childlike terror that he's about to be discovered, or even worse, abandoned, because of who he is this great sort of spine that runs all the way through the story and gives it its emotional heft. And you know, that moment, that lovely moment when he's just being an asshole and he wanders in and he sees the wedding ring is off, and that's a little a little panicky, and then she's not in the room. He's like, "Where were you? Wait," you know, and that and the hidden 5-year-old that he's always worried is about to be uncovered. is a really lovely way in which the doom is always hanging over your characters, no matter how funny or how powerful they think they are. And that always powers everything in your stuff.
Well, it's very similar to the story that he mentioned of yours, in which you declare very early, I think it's the first sentence in that story, that the tower goes down. And so you know that doom is coming for all of these characters, although you do think maybe a few of them will escape it, and you're sort of reading to find out if they do. But very often you have that in your stories, but I'm also thinking of Project X, where you've got a sense that things are going to go very, very, very bad. And you are almost not wanting to attach emotionally to these characters, but you must, because you fall in love with them, or you empathize with them, and you're wondering if that's a refraction of what you know is coming, if that's informing it, but at the same time, because you know that that's not going to be good, it feels as if you're falling in love with the wrong girl. But it's actually that. It does have, those two stories do have quite a lot in common with one another because of that element of darkness and doom that you wish to forestall but can never.
And worry that you somehow have earned, because again, the Aristotle's model for literature is flaws of character produce flaws of behavior for which the characters must take, responsibility. And that, the lovely thing again about the dinner party is the sense that this guy feels, he begins by saying he's so aggrieved, but the main strain running throughout that is I'm not worthy, and somebody's going to figure that out, and once they do, the roof is going to fall in,
Yeah, it also, the story I thought of with the dinner party is the story in your book, the very short story where the father and the son and a wall of water coming at them. And it's interesting that the characters in these stories, it's not like a cheap horror movie where these really hopeful teens go into the woods and are slaughtered. There's a sense, not just from us, there's a sense from them of their own doom and being unable to escape that. Is that something that you guys really aspire to write in your work too? That
well, you can see why we're
self-aware.
You can see why we're so famous, because when you say to people, "You got to read this. It's about doom," and people are like, "Oh, I'll Grandma will love it," that kind of thing. I don't know if this is true of Josh, but I am really interested in exploiting in readers that sense we have of being able to compartmentalize, and we go through life like that, right? Like we don't go, you don't go, "Hey, you want to go out to dinner? What's the point? I'm going to die." We live as though we don't register certain things coming, and I love exploiting that in the shape of the work. So as Josh was saying, I'll have stories that go, "Here's what's going to happen at the end. Everything terrible," and the reader goes, "Well, but maybe not."
Our guy's going to escape.
Yeah, and so you start moving forward, right? And I like interrogating that tendency we have, because it is what allows us to hope. It is what allows us to love. But it's also, deeply weird in some ways, right? That we sort of do this.
The difference, from what I understand, the difference between an illusion and a delusion would be something like, if I were under the illusion that I was going to become the president of the United States, that seems like a fairly long shot. And yet it's not completely impossible.
Right.
It may happen. But a delusion would be me saying, I'm going to become the 16th president of the United States. And that's just totally foreclosed. I find it very interesting, the spectrum of illusion to delusion that my characters could be on. And I also find it a great challenge, as I think you demonstrate in story after story, to let the reader know that there might be some other consciousness at work that knows how deluded these various characters are. And there's a lot of ironic play in that, a lot of fun to be had in that. But I also think it is something more serious, which is to say that delusions have big consequences, and they matter significantly and have a big impact on individuals' lives. And when you were talking about history and the moments in which an author comes to conclude, but we can't know about that. That would be speculation. It always interests me then, because I feel as if so much fiction whether in the form of outright lies, misinformation, illusion, or delusion, or simply sort of the willingness to dream, has informed the decisions that have gone into the lives that have led to biographies and histories that ended in doom and all the rest of it. And so it's no less crucial. Fiction itself is no less crucial, or no less crucially informing the lives of people that are the subjects of nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And yet it seems to be that these things are very compartmentalized. One of the things that I love about your work is how you insist on those fictions joining forces with non-fictional characters. And I think it's the same with me on a far lesser, on a far smaller historical scale. I want to see the ways, especially in stories, that domestic lives are ruined by people's inability to see not only their own weaknesses and occlusions, but those of their loved ones.
Even as they imagine themselves to be wildly free of illusion, right? Yeah. And quite self-conscious, right? I mean, that's one of the other pleasures of so many of your narrators.
This is for Mr. Shepard.
Oh boy!
I had a discussion with my brother. Both of us read your collection, and I was about 10 years old when that tower went down. I had no recollection of it ever happening. And my brother and I were saying, well, he must have made that up. And then we went to, I happened to look back at the book. I said, no, there's congressional hearings. It's chapter and verse. How do you stumble upon all this weirdness?
First of all, you need to be someone who doesn't get out a lot. And, you know, part of the reason that there's an interesting historical reason why that is such an obscure story. First of all, of course, the Air Force wanted it to be an obscure story because they were criminally negligent. But also, it just so happened that the story broke pretty much the week of Kennedy's inauguration. And, you know, the press was just like, it just doesn't have the right tone. You know, we killed all these guys for no reason, but it's the new frontier. So the story disappeared, essentially. And I came across that the way I come across so many things. I'm in a windowless room reading something no one else in their right mind would be reading, and that leads me to something else. And in this case, I had started researching the distant early warning system, which is the system across the northern arc of North America that we put in place to let us know if there was a Russian attack coming over the pole, because I thought, well, this has to be one of the shittiest jobs ever, because these were all manned bases. So you'd be there by yourself with one other person, hundreds and hundreds of miles from supply, you know, and I just thought, what a great job. I have to write about this. So I'm reading about it, and it's as dreary and awful as you would expect, but nothing is, as I was saying today in my talk, nothing was catching my attention in that emotional way. I was just going, wow, that would be horrible to be there. And then pretty much almost at the end of this history of the dew line, this character just goes, well, as bad as it wasn't as bad as the Texas Towers. And I was like, what are the Texas Towers? And I went and looked it up, and I was like, oh my God, why didn't I know about this, right? And so then I started researching, essentially.
Jim, the story I really enjoyed in your recent collection, Wall-to-Wall Counseling, and what I found effective about it was the laugh-out-loud humor, but at the same time, somebody's going to die because of the foibles and the insurance troubles these people have. And it is that simple question of how does one go about putting that humor with doom?
Yeah. It turns out that one of the ways human beings deal with doom is you either ignore it, you become sociopathic and, you know, dead inside, or you register the absurdity of the situation and you start to take some solace from the dark comedy of it. And in the case of that story, I was very interested in the way the kind of functionary who does something that we would think, how do you live with yourself, right? You're working for the insurance companies and you're taking health insurance away from people who really need to have it. How do you live with that? Besides, I don't want to lose my job, part of what I was getting when I was talking to people was that you sort of forget is that sense of the world pouring in at you from all angles, right? Where it's like, I got to deal with my mother, my sister's coming to visit, my kid is freaking out. Meanwhile, these people want their coverage. They're not going to get their coverage, but and that sense of being set upon from all directions is another way in which I think we compartmentalize. And suddenly we feel like, you have the guard at Dachau going, what a day I've had. You wouldn't believe it, right? And as far as he's concerned, he's had a really well, you wouldn't believe it. His dog ran away, then there's this other thing, his wife doesn't like him, and they're complaining about something in the camp, who knows, but, and you just set everything in a separate little, and suddenly that gives you a little bit of insight as to how these people go through the day and go, well, I'm a perfectly fine human being, what's your problem, right? And that also, the grotesquerie of that generates comedy as well, I think, because you're always dealing with wildly shifting proportions in ethical terms, where somebody's you're worrying about this when this is going on, and that in itself is inherently absurd. I mean, that's like Beckett in a nutshell.
Josh, do you want to speak to that too, a little bit?
No, he did a great job.
Okay.
Yeah. Josh is already ready to shut this down, I think, right, Josh?
I was just daydreaming.
Yeah.
Here he goes again.
Josh, I love the way you write. It's very Hemingway-esque. I mean, there's just no extra words. And in order to do that, I feel like you need to really trust your reader and not over-explain things, which I think can be a hard thing to hold back on. When you write your first drafts, do you sort of just like let it all hang out and then, take a red pen to it, or is that sort of your natural instinct?
No, I have no natural instinct towards succinct lines. I mean, it's coming out copiously and grossly, and then reworked, I mean, I never underestimate the stupidity of the ideal reader, which means that I over-explain everything. And then only through revision do I recognize that really the reader is extremely smart and much smarter than my writing self. My revising self is much closer to the reader than the writing self. And I have to do very much what Jim suggested in his talk, which is to say, forgive myself for making these kind of errors. I don't think that those errors look any different from probably, a 20-year-old sitting down to write her first story in a college workshop. They start real creaky and overdetermined, and it is only through that higher order reviser that anything really gets taken away. And then at times, I will look back at things that I've written and think, I could have taken even more out, or what if I had left something, what if I'd left a little bit more in and been a little bit more generous? So the ratio, like the mixture is so delicate a thing that you're bound, as the person that's written it and published it and looked back on it, to think that you've got it wrong still, because there's just so much room for variety in that regard. There's just so much room for both for error and for, I think, indulgence. I mean, the reader might like your sentences and want more of them. But, I think one of the things that, as my teacher, Jim, has pointed out, you don't need to do something called seconding. That's something did you come up with that term?
I like to think so.
Yeah. And that is basically you say it once, and then in about 3 sentences you say it again, and then 4 paragraphs later you say it a third time. And it is just, it's a habit that people have, and it's an intuition that people have, and it's something that I think you can only get rid of through revision.
I used to tell Josh that I used to tease him that he was going back for the stragglers all the time. So he would do something and then he would go, you probably didn't get this. I'll do it again. But there's also a narcissism involved in it, right? Because you did something pretty well and you're like, I bet I could do that again, and you'd like it again, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think that's right. And you have to be like, look, they get it.
Yeah.
And you don't have to showboat all the time. And that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, we are about out of time. Before you guys join us upstairs for the book signing, let's give it up for Jim Shepard and Joshua Ferris. Thank you.
Good job. You read beautifully, by the way.